Alright, you all know what you're here for. That's right, I made even more Pokemon fainting animations. For anyone that's new here, basically I tried to create new Pokemon fainting animations. This video was meant to come out a lot earlier than it is now, and that's partly because I've been playing Pokemon Legends ZA. So, I'm the one who just saw that just now? That's actually crazy. So if you're interested, you can watch the full video later, but for now let's look at the previous video for comments suggesting which Pokemon make a fainting animation for. Okay, there are a lot more comments in the previous video, however that does mean that there are more options to choose from. Alright, after reading over the comments, I think the first Pokemon to try will be Magneton. I actually wanted to attempt the idea mentioned in the comment for the Magneton fainting animation, which specifically talked about each connected Magnemite splitting apart, slamming into each other, and then falling onto the ground. So I made this quick sketch of mine to visually sequence the steps of the fainting animation. Look, this was made in Microsoft Paint with a mouse, so it may not look that good, but it has the intended effect of mapping out the animation. This is something I've done before for some of my previous animations, but they don't look any better. I usually don't do this because whenever I did, I would end up not following it and just go completely off course due to either the idea not working out in reality, or just wanting to do something else entirely. The point is that we at least have an idea of what we're animating. However, right before we get to animating, I actually made the fainting animations this time in the stadium I created, which was at first used to showcase an original secret move animation I made for Typhlosion. The stadium itself isn't anything too crazy, but it's probably better than the black and random color backgrounds I would normally use for the fainting animations. Getting to the animation, for the beginning I just posed all three Magnemites to be close together to then keyframe them separating from each other and going into different directions in a triangular formation, which wasn't really intentional, it just kind of happened. Since I still got numerous comments from you all about the duration of these fainting animations, I tried to decrease how long they are so I didn't do as much as I would before, but the original idea will still work for the time constraint, as I kind of framed the time limit for these fainting animations to be around the same length as the Rayquaza fainting animation in Pokemon Battle Revolution. I will keep optimizing for future videos a generally agreeable length for the fainting animations. But as for Magneton, I made a quick test of it separating, slamming into itself, and falling onto the ground, and it showed me that more frames were required to get better timing for each part of the fainting animation. The next part was manipulating the magnet arms each Magnemite has to give each segment of the animation more presence. The tricky part about this was making sure each magnet arm didn't get in the way of the other Magnemite's magnet arms, as it would just go through each other if left alone. After adjusting the magnet arms, I also animated the screws to where the thinner ones just rotated, while the big screws rotated and extended outward from each Magnemite when they first initially split apart. Then I had the screws twist back into the Magnemites once they slam into each other, and go dormant once they fall to the ground. This leads to the next part of where they collide onto the ground. This part was simple as it's just the object falling from point A to point B. There was some technical stuff with the two Magnemites bouncing off the ground and settling, which is something I did in an attempt to show the Magnemites hitting the ground, kinda like dropping a bowling ball. You're probably wondering why the middle Magnemite doesn't follow that same logic and just kind of flutters to the ground instead. The answer for that is that I liked how it looked. What, you thought there would be a grand reason for that? Nah. To be honest, this was kind of by accident because I couldn't really have the middle one fall directly down, as it would clip through the other two Magnemites. So the solution was to have it fall forward a little bit, which I sort of just leaned into the concept of the middle Magnemite losing energy by falling slower than the other two and flapping its magnet arms as wings. Look, this still isn't even close to the most ridiculous thing I've done for an animation, as I had a Matang split itself in half like it was a final boss. So yeah, I don't think anything I do at this point will ever top that. Now after that I would normally be done, but I'm not a normal person, so I decided to add a little something extra to this animation. In a lot of my previous animations, I started to add visual effects in my animations, whether it be a Pokemon withering away from a ghostly fire, or a literal pancake. With that logic, I thought this would be the perfect place to add something. Since Magneton is three Magnemites held together probably through some electromagnetic means, I made this electric object through completely repurposing this cube with some vertex editing and a list of modifiers that gives it this lightning-esque shape. All I had to do at this point was give it a yellow color and have it stationed in between the gaps of each Magnemite's magnets when they separate to give off the appearance that the electricity is keeping them connected. Let's now see the full Magneton fainting animation. I ended up bringing some frames closer together so it's a little faster, but it could still end up being too long. I'll leave that to you all to figure out though. As for the process itself, Magneton being a simple Pokemon design with its head being its entire body, with just some magnet hands and screws, made it pretty easy for me to operate. I wanted to make sure that it felt like a mechanical object with the movement, but still has its own individuality for each Magnemite, well as much as you can get for the same three Pokemon slapped together. The electric effect isn't too special, but I think it adds a little bit extra to the animation. Alright, I've had enough of saying anything that has to do with the word magnet, so let's get to the next Pokemon. The next Pokemon I went with was Golurk. After seeing Golurk, I actually had an idea I came up with that I wanted to try. Some people may not know this, but Golurk's hands and legs can actually retract into itself using its arms and lower body as jet thrusters, enabling it to fly. So I drew up some sketches centered around this idea, but for this part right here, I didn't end up doing that. One, I felt it would take too much time of the fainting animation at the end if it were to crumble into rocks, and two, I wanted to save this effect for a different Pokemon in the future, as I think it will be better there. As for the animation, I started with forcibly shoving its arms and legs into itself, which which was easy to accomplish. This is so that we could prepare Golurk to ignite its thruster hands and torso. Then I had Golurk go up into the air and added a spinning motion to Golurk because I thought it was funny. Yeah, that's literally it, just because I thought it was funny. After that, I had Golurk kind of start getting affected by gravity here, as the plans to have the thrusters shut off and have Golurk fall down towards the ground. Now the falling part is where most of the time was spent. The problem is that I wanted to convey Golurk as the heavy individual it is when falling and colliding with the ground. I could make a visual effect with the ground breaking, but I wanted to actually show that with just Golurk alone and not an effect carrying the animation. It took a lot of trial and error to get the animation for Golurk hitting the ground. Even though it is a similar concept to the two Magnemites hitting the ground like I did earlier, it felt somewhat stiff. I ended up adding some movement to its arms, raising them as Golurk bounces off the ground, then Golurk rests its arms on the ground, ending the animation. Now I've been talking about Golurk's thrusters the whole time and none of you have actually seen it yet. Let's fix that. For the rocket thrusters, I'm actually reusing an old effect I made from my Reshiram animation, showing off the turbo blades on its tail. I took a sphere, cut it in half, stretched the vertices a bit, then added virtually the same shader I used for the original effect, just making a few changes so that the fire isn't as powerful as Reshiram's was. With that, the thruster effect is finished. All I needed to do was to put 3 different copies of it onto its arms and torso, applying constraints so that the effect stay on the parts that I put it on. I also had to keyframe the color ramp position value so that the flame could be ignited and extinguished whenever it was necessary within the fainting animation. As for the rest, I did animate the glowing of its runes and scar on its body to make it look like it was shutting down, as Golurk is a construct. Well, with that, here is the full Golurk fainting animation. As I mentioned earlier, I really wanted to include Golurk's ability to fly into its fainting animation, as that is something that surprised me when I first found out about it a while ago, that it can actually fly in the games. I wanted this fainting animation to be somewhat goofy like the fainting animations in Pokemon Battle Revolution, as a giant construct spinning into the air and falling is unexpected but amazing to look at. Besides getting the actual collision part correctly, the rest of the Golurk animation wasn't too hard to animate. Now we can move on to the final Pokemon for today. The third Pokemon I chose was Slacking. I was intrigued by the idea of making a different kind of fainting animation. What I mean by that is instead of a traditional fainting animation of the Pokemon falling over or collapsing, the concept of a super strong Pokemon like Slacking just falling asleep and not feeling like battling was something I wanted to try out. I won't lie, the drawings for the Slacking animation this time around are pretty cursed, so yeah. But you get the idea. Slacking lazes around, yawns while raising its head, rolls over onto its back, and then sleeps. The rolling over part I couldn't draw well because I don't draw often, but this in itself ended up being its own ordeal that I'll explain when we get there. For now, I started the fainting animation with Slacking resting its head on its arms as it would usually do. Then I had Slacking slowly lift up its hand towards its face and lean its head back to show off its tiredness. To complement this, I animated Slacking's mouth opening slowly as if it were yawning, which goes along with the plan of having all of Slacking's actions within this animation to be slow to properly show off Slacking drifting off to sleep. At this point, I'd say the first half of the animation looks good so far. Now as for this next part, I was actually having trouble with Slacking rolling over, in which I initially took out the part of Slacking rolling over and just ended the animation after it yawns. However, I felt I couldn't settle for that, so I spent some more time trying to get this part to work, in which after a little bit of time I was able to get Slacking to roll over onto its back so that the fainting animation could end how I wanted it to. Turns out it was actually simpler than I was making it out to be, with the only noteworthy part of this process was getting its arm to transition off of the ground in a clean way. Afterwards was just animating a few details, and with that, here is the final version of the Slacking fainting animation. I'm not gonna lie, this fainting animation is still longer than I would want it to be for a fainting animation, but if I wanted to stick to the idea of Slacking falling asleep for the animation, speeding it up wouldn't make sense, as Slacking is a large and lazy Pokemon, so it wouldn't work to rush it going to sleep. So this is what I ended up with. Now at this point, this would usually be the last Pokemon for the video, but this however is a bit lackluster to be the final fainting animation for the video, so this time I'm actually going to be including a fourth fainting animation, which is something I haven't done before, but I felt since this video is a bit late, I can get one more in for you all. Okay, the actual last Pokemon is going to be Abra. Since Abra's most memorable trait is that it teleports away during battle, I wanted to make a fainting animation around that concept. The idea is pretty simple, as we're just going to have Abra's teleportation go off a lot in a short span of time, then fall and hit the ground. I started the animation of Abra flinging itself backwards while holding its head with its hands, and then teleporting away at the end of the movement. After that, I basically set Abra into a bunch of different poses for each time it would teleport. Then for the final teleport, Abra would appear in the air like this, but after looking back at this whole sequence, I didn't end up liking it. This was because the poses that I had Abra in for the multi-teleports were pretty goofy, which isn't the problem, but I just felt there wasn't enough time in between each of the teleports to flesh out the animations for those poses, especially since I'm working under the guise of the fainting animation not being too long altogether. So I decided to opt for a bit more simpler approach and decided to manipulate the scale of Abra so that it squishes inward for each time it teleports, which doesn't look like it makes sense. Well, at least not yet. For now, the final teleport will have Abra fall from a bit of height and land onto the ground, bouncing off of it once before it becomes unconscious. After viewing the animation in its current state, you can already see the similarities to the original plan of the multiple teleports. But there is one more thing we need to apply before I can say the fainting animation is done. That is, well, the actual teleporting visual effect. Since the teleport effect is the crux of the entire fainting animation, I want to have that part be obvious and not something inferred with the sort of placeholder teleport effect I currently have here with Abra straight up disappearing. For this to work, I'm going to edit the shaders of the Abra model so that way I can make a disappearing visual effect that obscures Abra during each teleport. Now look, I know I've done this gimmick earlier in this video, but I am going to be reusing another one of my old effects. Some may call it lazy, but I'm going to classify it as being resourceful. All jokes aside, I'm going to be using the phasing effect that I created for Necrozma that was in my old Terrapagos animation. Just going to copy it over with a few changes and there we go. Now Abra looks like it's teleporting out of existence. Well, almost. I want to add one more layer, if you would, to the overall teleport effect to give it a little bit more flair. I decided to add some particle effects, specifically in a star shape for each time Abra teleports. I'm gonna be honest with you, I really couldn't think of anything else. But with the teleport effect completed, this is the full Abra fainting animation. The Abra animation ended up being slightly longer than planned, but at least not to the point of it being a makeshift cutscene like some of my previous fainting animations. My only complaint about this fainting animation is that since there isn't that much time for the animation as a whole, I had to be efficient with the amount of frames I had so that the multi-teleport will be properly represented, and not go by too fast so that the person watching would actually understand what's happening. With this Abra animation and some of the other fainting animations in this video, I've started to mess around with animating the camera as it would make watching certain fainting animations feel more dynamic. Of course, this doesn't work for every single scenario, as there really isn't a reason to mess with the camera too much for a Pokemon like Slacking, for instance, as it doesn't really move around that much. I do think I will continue modifying the camera movement for future fainting animations, as it definitely feels more immersive than a static view. Now, I'm gonna be honest, this video took far longer than it should have for it to come out, so hopefully I can get future videos out with a lot less delay than this one. And also, please leave your suggestions down below for which Pokemon to make a fainting animation for. I might even use the idea for the fainting animation itself depending on if it is possible or not. Well, at least for my skill levels, I might be a bit washed after not animating for a few months. Alright, I think that's everything for now. Thank you all for watching and I will see you next time.